Hello, everybody. This is our second week of attention, first lecture dedicated to beauty, probably one of the most complicated subjects in the history of art. We don't have much time, so it's going to be impossible to do it justice, but I want to take you through a few important concepts that you can use as tools to address modern and contemporary art when you visit museums, galleries, or even when you make work today. First of all, what is beauty? It's probably one of the most difficult questions to answer, and we're not going to be able to answer it in full, but we're going to try to think about different conceptions of beauty and especially try to move away from the cliches of what beauty really is. You know, we can easily say that beauty is a very subjective matter, right? So, what's beautiful to me is not beautiful to you, but truth is that beauty is a lot more complicated than that. Beauty is something, a sense of beauty or an aesthetic judgment of what beauty might be, is something you develop over time. And it's something you don't develop alone. Even if we like to revert to this cliche that beauty is a subjective entity, you will find that a lot of what you like might be shared by people who were born around your same time, who were born in the same geographical area, country, same race, gender. There are many coordinates that dictate what we find beautiful collectively. And even when you think you are the only person in the world to like one thing, if you go online, you'll probably find that there's a forum for it or some sort of group dedicated to it on Facebook. That's why beauty is so mind-boggling. It's a very complicated concept to pin down, and nonetheless it attracts attention, right? The whole of art, if you like, for thousands of years has been entirely about beauty and capturing beauty, preserving beauty, right? The idea that everything fades, everything that's beautiful doesn't last long enough. But one of the important things about modern and contemporary art is that clearly they both are characterized by a very fraught relationship with beauty. You go to a museum or a gallery space, and it's hard to find something that looks beautiful, that you can just say, whoa, look at this. And there's a reason for it. We're going to discover why that is throughout this lecture. But I also think that the reason why many contemporary artists over the past 50 years have rejected beauty is perhaps come to a certain turning point now. We need to perhaps rethink our relationship with beauty because it's gone too far the opposite direction. So before we get thinking about contemporary, modern and contemporary art and its relationship with beauty, I wanted to show you some images that many of us will consider beauty, and you can appreciate how beauty takes on a different signification if you consider the cultural context in which the artifact is produced. Um, this is the quintessential idea of the beautiful in classical art when it comes to sculpture. But the sculptures I showed you previously were beautiful in ways that resonate differently in other cultural contexts and in the Western context too. Now, there's something I wanted to say about classical art, especially, and its worship of beauty. There's something about the Greeks and what they discovered about our response, our aesthetic response to beauty, that's fascinating. They looked at nature and natural forms, and in natural forms, they found the golden ratio, as they called it, a proportional ratio that repeats itself across the wings of butterflies, the structure of seashells, the shape of leaves, and is perceived by us as the incarnation of harmony. It's something that makes the soul feel serene and calm. And that's what they appropriated from the natural world and applied to the making of their artworks. Now, Polyclitus and his Doryphorus are actually is an incredible example of how the golden ratio applies to the proportion of the human body. So the head has to be contained 7 times into the height of the body to convey this sense of harmony and beauty and balance that we experience every time we see a classical sculpture. But there's, of course, a different way in which this beautiful head of Ife from contemporary Nigeria conveys beauty differently. And again, it poses questions, this work poses questions of what is beauty, where does beauty lie, and how do the cultural connotations and reference points of the beautiful apply in different time periods and different geographical areas. The classical art that emerges during the 18th centuries, we're thinking of neoclassicism, well represented here by Canova, proposes a reprise again of the classical rules of proportion and beauty. And there's something fascinating about this return. You know, throughout, you can say, the history of the world, art serves a purpose that entails elevation. It entails a focus on the beautiful parts of life, because life is made of horror, distress, pain, and beauty. And to crystallize that beauty is the antidote, right? It's something that enables us to face the messiness of life and to feel like there's a purpose to it. So that's why classical art in the West returns to these archetypes of beauty that were explored in classical Greece. And in classical Greek art, the notion of a beautiful and proportioned body hid more than just the aesthetic pleasure. There is something important about the notion of a healthy mind in a healthy body. So, how would you possibly represent a healthy mind through the medium of a sculpture, which is all pretty much the Greeks had at the time, along with painting, in order to materialize visually these concepts? So then the beauty and the purity, the proportionality of the body represents a inner value, something that's deeper, something that is more important. Yes, I'm sure, however, that you can appreciate the pitfall. It's equally beautiful to just look at these bodies and enjoy them for what they bring to the surface. Beautiful bodies. How do we scratch the surface of the beautiful in order to access its elevating conceptual dimension is the real conundrum. And it's the real conundrum that modern and contemporary artists find themselves grappling with. The Renaissance as well, of course, as the first reprise of classical art and Roman art, capitalizes on the notion that paintings must be beautiful. Everything you create must be beautiful. So beauty is this attractor, right? It attracts the attention of the viewer. But our question today is, what is the value of this attraction? What do we learn through beauty that we don't know already? And does beauty prevent us from accessing higher conceptual dimensions in modern and contemporary art? So I wanted to start considering this date. You will see that this week's lectures focus on two moments, one in the last century, 1917, the other one in 1863, that we can actually contextualize as an assault on beauty. And we'll see why 1917 is important in a minute. But before we get there, I wanted you to think about this conception, this interestedness. Now, this interestedness is a conception that was formulated by Immanuel Kant in the Critique of Judgement, published in 1790, and that becomes central to the work of Marcel Duchamp, starting from his first ready-mades in 1912 and 1913. It's impossible here, with the time we have and the space we have, to really condense a complex book such as the Critique of Judgement, but I wanted to take out two main concerns of Kant to take with us through this journey. One is that art is intentionally produced but remains functionless. The other is his concern with the judgment of beauty in nature and how this can be transposed to works of art. There are four true characteristics of our judgment of what is beautiful in the book, and they are disinterestedness, universalism, necessity, and purpose. So a beautiful object is purposive, containing the property or quality of purposefulness without actually having a concrete purpose. Kant believes that we respond to the object's rightness of design, which satisfies our imagination and intellect, even though we are not evaluating the object's purpose or meaning. Now, this is food for thought. Let's consider a painting as famous as Starry Night by Van Gogh. How does this apply? For instance, according to Kant's philosophy, our pleasure in viewing Starry Night derives from our intuition and understanding triggered by the purposiveness of its forms. There is something aesthetically pleasing about the arrangement of shapes and blend of colors that causes us pleasure without directly applying to a concrete or known concept that we may have for how churches should look or how the stars should be arranged in the sky. Kant would also refuse personal connotations and interpretations. So the fact that we might like Starry Night because it contains our favorite color of blue becomes irrelevant to true aesthetic judgment. Now, this will take a little time to process, but let's also remind ourselves of the fact that when Starry Night was completed, people didn't like it. Van Gogh only sold one painting in his lifetime, and his brother was a very successful art dealer. So what does that tell us about the conception of beauty through time and how the same object can be deemed ugly at at a specific moment in history, and then beautiful to the point that it's assigned an economic value of millions and millions of dollars just about 100 years later. So, to Marcel Duchamp and inching closer to 1917. This is one of his earliest ready-made, the bicycle wheel. And just to introduce to you the concept of ready-made, since it's so central to contemporary art, it's basically an object that already exists in the world, not created by the artist through molding, casting, plying. It's basically an object that's been made, and in this case here of Duchamp, manufactured by industries at the beginning of the last century, replicas, multiples, in this specific instance, coming together. Not all ready-made are combined, like in this case. Some of them are pure, where one object has been slightly altered by the artist in order to produce an artwork out of a mass-produced object. But the ready-made was Duchamp's revolutionary statement. It poses important questions, not just about what is beauty, but what is art? Is art something that has to be beautiful? Or you as an artist can decide what art is just because you are an artist. And if you decide today that the bottle rack is the way you're going to express yourself, then why not? And also, what is important in art? Is it the beauty of the manual skills that have been developed over time? Or is it the concept in the artwork that make us think? You can see a beautiful painting that technically has no content, but that's been executed beautifully in a classical way. What is its cultural value? Is it relevant that it's beautiful? Or is it relevant that it says something important? So this is what the ready-mades by Duchamp are trying to tackle. And I also wanted to, before I move to 1917 and talk about the very controversial urinal called Fountain made by Duchamp, I also wanted to introduce this artist called Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringoven, because as some of you might know, there has been a lot of controversy around Fountain over the past about 7 years, especially, because Fountain is considered to be the most important work of art of the last century by many, and it might have not been made by Duchamp himself. There are letters written by Duchamp to others which cast doubt over the attribution, and Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringoven was a Dada artist, a very one of the very few female Dada artists who was really out of the box, really creative, really inventive. And she may have been the one who submitted Fountain to the exhibition, the Dada exhibition in New York, which took place in 1917, at which Fountain was actually laughed at and thrown in the trash and dismissed by the very Dada artists who claimed they were going to be extremely open-minded and exhibit anything submitted by anybody in their exhibition. So, as I just care to say this because, as you know, women have been misrepresented and sidelined in the history of art by art historians as well as art institutions, and there is no final resolution. If you go to any museum who owns a urinal by Duchamp, it's still attributed to Duchamp. No museum has gone as far as recognizing the fact that it might be Elsa's work, but I just wanted you to be aware of this important controversy of attribution, especially because one of the most important artworks in the history of the last century, or art itself, is at stake. So, the ready-mades, again. Ready-mades are really challenging because they offer very little to grip on, and especially because the handlebar of beauty has gone. What is beautiful about a urinal? Probably nothing. But believe it or not, once the function was removed, right, this urinal is not functional. We do not approach it to use it. That's when our imagination begins to see things. And this is actually something that wasn't just Duchamp's invention. You know, the Christian church realized this, the Catholic church realized this a long time ago with relics. You know, you put relics of saints in cabinets. You cannot touch these objects. They instantly acquire value, cultural value in our minds, and we begin to think about them differently. It's the conception, the Heideggerian conception of the hammer that we use and we don't think about until it's broken. And then suddenly we start looking at it to try and work out what it is that could make it return to function, and then think about the object in a very different way. So, beauty, urinals, Duchamp. Something important happens in the history of the world to motivate the appearance of the ready-made, and especially the appearance of this work, as well as another one that I'm sure you're familiar with, that I'll show you in a second. And believe it or not, this something has to do with this painting that I'm sure you all know. Now, what's the story with Mona Lisa, and why is Mona Lisa the most famous painting in the world? I know it sounds to you like I'm going everywhere and back again, but it all makes sense and it all links together. Now, I took this picture at the Louvre quite a few years ago, and this is the experience of Mona Lisa at the Louvre. It's one of those few works of art that you can see in person there at the Louvre, but you really see less than if you were to look it up online or in a book. It actually looks like the stock market, right? People are bidding. It's an incredibly chaotic scene. The question, of course, is why bother? This painting is on the bucket lists of everybody who remotely has an interest in art, never mind experts. And even, you know, us experts who sometimes sneer at Mona Lisa have been there. We've all gone there to see what the fuss is about. And, you know, it's fascinating because this is how close you can actually get to it. You can't. I actually had the opportunity to see Mona Lisa in the very late 90s when it wasn't set up this way, and you could actually get a little closer. It was so much more intimate. And then, of course, with the change in travel and tourism, it was necessary for the Louvre to heighten the security of the painting. You can see there it's behind bulletproof glass, and to also keep everyone at bay. Now, why is Mona Lisa the most famous painting in the world? And how does that connect with beauty in modern and contemporary art, and with Duchamp and a urinal? Well, in order to understand the importance of Mona Lisa, we need to return to a while back. And that while back is a few years before 1917. It's 1911. Now, before 1911, Mona Lisa, as you can see here, used to sit among other paintings, not quite the celebrity painting it is today. And then, one morning in 1911, this was the scene. Mona Lisa is no longer on the wall. And it took the Louvre about a day to raise any issue with it because many suspected that the photographer, the in-house photographer of the Louvre, had removed the painting to take pictures of it and took it to his studio. So at the time, you could just grab a painting if you were the photographer in one of these museums, take it out for lunch, take a picture, and return it whenever you wanted. So as you can see, that has changed now, luckily, with our museums. So after about 24 hours, it was realized that Mona Lisa was gone. And that caused something unprecedented. Mona Lisa appears on the front pages of newspapers around the world. This is the first time in modern times where media like newspapers have now become illustrated that images of a painting become readily available to everyone around the world as a mechanical repetition. And of course, Italy isn't pleased. On the left-hand side, you can see this illustration on La Domenica del Corriere, a very famous publication in Italy, even speculating that it might be two people stealing the painting. It couldn't possibly be the work just of an individual. Newspaper columns and even clairvoyants offered rewards to identify the location of the Mona Lisa. And of course, satire, the French and their humor, as you can see, criticizing here the lax security at the Louvre. This is probably one of my favorites, the very contemporary idea of what is there now to paint at the Louvre, and again, the security measures that have come in place. And here, the question, what do you do if you steal Mona Lisa, right? If you're the thief, you can't really share it with family and friends. Now, who did it? Well, for a while, it was suspected that Picasso did it. But how could he do it with those hands? Okay, joking. Those are beautiful brioche. But yeah, Picasso had actually got caught up already in the theft of some Iberian sculptures at the Louvre. So the police went to him. It was a very complicated situation for him. And it turned out that it was this guy. Now, Perugia, Italian, he worked at the Louvre and he believed the painting should be returned to Italy. You know how there's, again, a lot of misconception about this issue. Italy wants the painting back, but it wasn't stolen by Napoleon, as many claim. It was actually taken by Leonardo to Fontainebleau when he moved there. And that's why the painting remained in France and ended up at the Louvre eventually. But you can imagine, like, Mona Lisa is a massive cash cow, and no surprise, Italy wants it back. So Perugia decided to take it upon himself in 1911 to return the painting. It took him a while to come up with that plan, but you can see here again speculation on how the theft happened based on his admission that he took it out of the frame. He hid inside the museum basically overnight, then came out when everything was closed, took it out of the frame, and just walked out the door. That's pretty much how you steal Mona Lisa in 1911. However, what he didn't quite plan as well was how to return it to Italy. So the painting was returned to Italy a couple of years later to the Uffizi, where apparently Perugia showed up and told those at the entrance that he wanted to speak to the museum director so that he could sell Mona Lisa to them. Well, of course, they called the police, and the rest is pretty much history. Mona Lisa was found again, so again, another round of newspaper and reproduction of that image circulates around 1913, 1914. There was a lot of press coverage because, of course, France was extremely glad to have recovered the painting. the painting toward Italy before it returned to France. So you can imagine the cultural resonance of um, the the return of Mona Lisa to the scene, and that's what prompts Duchamp to do this. Now, in 1919, Duchamp is terribly vexed with the idea that everyone considers Mona Lisa the most beautiful painting in the world without even understanding even what Mona Lisa is about. He's fed up with people just as much as he's fed up with the system that keeps enshrining classical art in 1919 as the highest expression of artistic creation. So he creates this. Now, this is a postcard drawing of Mona Lisa. As you can see, is defaced Mona Lisa with mustache and a goatee, which has been also misunderstood. This really drives me around the bend when I read that Duchamp, according to some, Duchamp was trying to hint at the homosexuality of Leonardo. Very unlikely stuff that Duchamp was not really concerned with. Most likely, this is a kind of like careless sort of defacing that you do when you're bored with something. Think about the times you were on the phone with a friend and took Britney Spears' picture on the cover of People's Magazine and just gave her a mole and some whatever scar just for the fun of it. This is the reference that Duchamp is putting through, this channeling. This is about irreverence. And the letters that you see at the very bottom, if read in French at a certain speed, will phonetically express this content. She has a hot ass. So you can see how Duchamp is out there to make fun of the painting. Why is everyone so obsessed with this painting? She must have a hot ass. And of course you can't even see it because that's what the painting shows, the upper part of a body. You can claim that this is a sexist joke, absolutely. You can go through the whole history of art, especially during the Surrealist and Dada period, and find sexist jokes left, right, and center. Not condoning them, but we have to always be able to remember that it was a different time and what was socially accepted was different. So you have to be able to not justify an excuse, but to and to of course understand that this is not where we'll go today. But at the same time, you have to try. That was the biggest challenge in history always when I grew up. Try to imagine the world of 100 years ago with the minds of those who lived there and what they didn't know that we know today in order to contextualize their actions and words. We tend to forget that a lot today and just jump to conclusion and demonize everything. But yes, Marcel Duchamp was a great painter himself, and he painted this. This is one of the many paintings he made at the time, and it was laughed at, right? When it came to New York in 1913, and you can see this colliding of dates, right? The idea that his painting was laughed at, but Mona Lisa, that was made 500 years prior, was recovered, and it's just the painting of a pretty lady, was incensed as this amazing accomplishment in art, really rubbed him off the wrong way. And that's where the ready-mades come from. This rejection of traditional art. Even painting to him, for as much as this is extremely avant-garde and still, even if it's extremely experimental, it's still painting. And he's basically losing faith in painting. He thinks, what the hell is painting for at this point? Hence, we have this urinal. Now, this also coincides with a certain death of beauty, a certain end of generosity on behalf of the artist when it comes to engage the viewer. The implication here is that beauty might be an easy way in, that we might get distracted from something more meaningful, from questions like the one posed by the urinal, which is, what is art? Can you believe we went on for hundreds and hundreds of years making beautiful art and never asking that real question through art itself? So now I wanted to bring you back to another date that is super important, 1863. Because in 1863, it's where we really find the first shock to the system of beauty. And to understand that, we need to travel to Paris and consider the Academy of Beaux-Arts. Now, the Academy was the upholder of traditional standards for French painting, both in content and style. Historical subjects, religious themes, and portraits were valued. Landscape and still life were not. And the Academy preferred carefully finished images which mirrored reality when examined closely. Color was somber and conservative, and the traces of brushstrokes were suppressed, concealing the artist's personality, emotions, and working techniques. This is basically the epitome of classical art. And if you went to the Academy of Beaux-Arts, you would be trained in the classical style only. Now, from today's standpoint, we can appreciate how different the outlook is. Today, those who attend art education, those who want to study art, are invited to do the exact opposite, not to conceal their artistic personality or emotions, and to actually embrace the medium in ways that classical art would have never acknowledged. So, what happens in 1863? Well, the juries of the Academy is organizing the Salon. The Salon is a very important institution in France at this time. It's a yearly exhibition in which works of art are seen. Just imagine a world without films, without entertainment ready at hand, apart from theater and ballet. These exhibitions were massive. Thousands and thousands of people would go to the Salon and see art. But in 1863, something really important happened. So the juries sharply worded rejection of a painting by Manet is key, as well as the unusually large number of rejected works that year set off a firestorm among French artists. After seeing the rejected works in 1863, Emperor Napoleon III decreed that the public be allowed to judge the work themselves, and the Salon de Refusés was organized. While many viewers came only to laugh, the Salon de Refusés drew attention to the existence of a new tendency in art and attracted more visitors than the regular Salon. So this is how it kind of backfired. And this is pretty much the way in which the Salon would be set up. This is actually a gallery at the Louvre at the time. You can see how paintings would be exhibited upwards all the way to the ceiling. If you were a good painter, considered to be a talented painter, your work would be exhibited at eye level. If not, you could be closer to the ceiling. And of course, larger paintings would stay in the upper levels as well because they were easier to decipher. And again, another example here of how different the enjoyment of art was at this time, how different the consumption of art was. So, what happens that year in 1863 at the official Salon? Well, this is the winner, The Birth of Venus by Alexandre Cabanel. It's the epitome of classical painting. Actually, we should say neoclassical painting. You can see the beautiful naked body. We've got all the Venuses in the classical tradition coming out to condense into this porcelain-like, statuesque body. And not only the classical theme, of course, the birth of Venus, but this is also objectifying of the female body in a way that was, again, very common at the time. I actually have nicknamed this the post-orgasmic Venus over time because you can clearly see that Venus is not just busy coming to life here. There's an implication on her face and her posture that's making her a perfect sexual object for the male gaze. So not only this painting was awarded the gold medal by the jury, so it was elevated to the standard, the highest possible standard at the time. But Napoleon III loved it so much, he bought it for himself. So you can understand why certain artists like Edouard Manet, who had always had a rebellious streak, thought enough is enough. We really need to make some statements about this hegemony of classical art, whiteness, this notion of beauty of a classical kind, the suppression of the artist's desires and intent. So this is the painting that was rejected, right? The painting by Manet that caused the controversy and which then went on to spur the Salon de Refusé. Why did it cause controversy? Because it's a very enigmatic scene presenting us with a female nude, as you can see here. But the lady we see here is surrounded by two young men clothed in the fashion of the time. So that connotation takes the painting elsewhere. We're not in classical Greece. We are not in this mythological dimension where Venus emerges from the sea, but we're in contemporary times. So people thought that was a breach of classical rules, an unforgivable one. Only portraits could represent the now and the present. Other subjects had to represent the past. And this is a present that most Parisians, especially the bourgeoisie that flocked to the salon, didn't want to know about. These are young lefties, members of the Parisian youth, frolicking in the woods. And you can see here there's an interesting detail in the lady at the back, which seems to be washing herself in the river. Now, at the time, because of the spread of syphilis, the French government had shared guidelines with the population, and prostitutes especially were advised to wash between clients in order to keep down the rate of infection. So you can see how at the time these references wouldn't go unnoticed. They're almost meaningless to us today. Also, the return of the gaze that we see here, you can see this lady naked staring back at us, therefore drawing us into the scene as if we had just came upon them and are surprised, looking, perhaps casting judgment, and we see this gaze returned without any shame. There is no fear in the eyes of this lady who confidently looks back at the viewer. So this is also where the scandal of the breakfast on the grass was. But Manet had an extra gear, and there is something fascinating But Manet had an extra gear, and there's something really fascinating. There's a trap in this painting. So when you look at this beautiful work, The Judgment of Paris, engraving after Raphael since the original has gone missing, and you focus on the right-hand side, you might notice something that looks suddenly familiar to us. Oh yes, here they are. This is exactly the scene that Manet appropriated from one of the masters of classical art and turned into his painting. It also, the painting by Manet also references a number of classical previous representations that, for a reason or another, were never accused of being obscene and never shocked the public. So what Manet was out there to do was to incorporate classical art and reveal its hypocrisy, to incorporate the beauty of these scenes that were perceived as filled with ethical value, moral, and decorum, and actually reveal that these are questionable too. So the tradition that Manet draws from is essentially based on beauty itself. The history of art, Western art, of course, that is Italian art more specifically, is filled with Venuses because Venus is the goddess of love. But of course, it's impossible not to suspect that the reason why Venuses are so abundant in the history of art is simply because they're naked women, right? And these were commissioned by male patrons who had lots of money, and it was the next best thing to pornography at the time. With the absence of photography, these paintings actually look erotically charged in a way that we cannot quite even understand. Just imagine a world without photography and film, and how paintings must have resonated with this intensity visual intensity that was today has gone somewhat muted. So you can see how the Venus and the beauty of the Venus returns in art. And as we will see, Manet has his eyes firmly planted on this archetype because he realizes that here lies the hypocrisy of classical art itself. So in 1863, after seeing the Venus by Cabanel, he makes this. This painting technically is the beginning of modern art. Now, modern art is characterized by a rejection of classical rules. You will find that almost the entirety of modern artists were classically trained, so they knew exactly what they were taking on. They knew the challenge. But this painting is not designed to please the viewer anymore. Think about the Venus by Cabanel, and you can clearly imagine how it was an eye candy. Beautiful naked woman there, an eye candy for the male gaze. But here we have a painting designed to upset. A little bit like the Déjeuner Célèbre, you know, the breakfast on the grass was designed to make people think, what am I looking at? You know, that's the same question Duchamp picks up later on in 1917 with the urinal. What is art? So this conceptual engagement is actuated by Manet through a very interesting replacement. The Venus that we have seen in all these previous paintings, you can see the similarities in composition. I'm sure these are not going lost on you savvy visual consumers. So the Venus, the nakedness of the Venus is replaced through the prostitute. Who we see here, Olympia, is a fictional character. She's a prostitute of contemporary Paris. So again, Manet plays the same game he had already played with the Déjeuner, and he brings painting into the political reality of the now. And that's something people found extremely offensive. He does so by clearly stating that Parisian society is filled with prostitutes at this time who transcend and upset the hierarchy of social structures in France. It was well known at the time that Napoleon III went to the brothel, and some of the prostitutes who knew him were entrusted with state secrets and other diplomatic information that nobody else, apart from the very high strata of society, would be included in. So you can really see how prostitutes in Paris become this emblem of the unruly, the emblem of the power that operates outside of the hierarchical structure. Manet is not quite out there to judge or cast a shadow on prostitution, but he basically says, here it is. This is really not this Venus coming to birth from the purity of the sea that represents today. This is what represents today. And you can see the black maid on the right-hand side, which gives Olympia flowers, symbolizing her success. Olympia is not a street prostitute. She is desired. She is loved by her customers. And of course, the presence of the black maid also caused a lot of controversy because of the representation of a black person in a painting. So you can imagine the charge of this painting, revolutionary and deliberately structured to push people's buttons. And what pushed people's buttons? Since to us today, maybe the painting doesn't look that tragically charged with irreverence. Well, at the time, people would have recognized Olympia as a prostitute because of the choker that you see there and the flower in her hair that had become a popular cliche among prostitutes. And then there's this. The hand is the most important part of Olympia. Now, the hand in previous Venuses was actually titillating. If you look back, you will notice that there's some suggestion there of pleasuring going on in the hands of Venuses in Renaissance art. But Olympia's hand says, not until you pay. Look at the power of the hand, positioned not as a gesture of shame. There's no shame in Olympia. She looks back at us And by the way, this is Victorine again, the same model that looks back at us in The Breakfast on the Grass. And you can see here how the hand really is a tool of power in this case. Then, of course, as I mentioned, the Black Maid became extremely controversial just because of the question, which at the time seemed very plausible. Why should we even look at a black person in a painting? And the Black Cat, along with the shoe. Now, the shoe doesn't look particularly frivolous to us today, but at the time it was seen as such. And Venus's sort of, didn't need this kind of frivolous connotation. So that is what gives away Olympia too as a prostitute, while the Black Cat, which has replaced the dog in the Venus of Urbino that we saw earlier by Titian, represents witchcraft, represents danger, represents spells, everything that Olympia stands for in the mind of high society, as you see here. And the unfurled bed, the sheets that clearly have been lived in. This is so shocking for the time, as the color of her skin. She's not quite as white and statuesque as the Venus by Cabanel. She actually displays an idiosyncratic relationship with the beauty of the female body. She's not proportioned like a classical sculpture either. And this is how the press received the painting. As you can see, it was satirized, with some even claiming that you could smell the feet of Olympia because she conveyed this sense of dirt, right? Nothing like the Venus by Cabanel. And again, here it is. Look at the gaze. Look how she looks back at us. Look at how defiant she is. The statement seems to be, here I am, so what? And I wanted to wrap up today's lecture with a work of art by Yasumasa Morimura, a Japanese artist who attracted a lot of attention in 1988 when he exhibited this take on Manet's Olympia. Now, this is an incredibly rich, complicated, and interesting photograph that plays with the notion of beauty, but also in consideration of cultural identity as well as gender connotations and racial connotations. To understand this work from a certain perspective, you can look at the artist's statements about his upbringing in Japan and how he was, Japan worshipped Western art following the reopening of Japan's borders and commerce in the 1860s. The influx of Western art in Japan has been enormous, and with that, a cultural change has pervaded the creativity of Japanese people. So Morimura has said in more than one interview that he was trained to love Western classical art, from Leonardo to Dürer. That's the style that you need to master. And that's despite, of course, the great tradition of Japanese art. And he's in 1988, he felt confident enough to make a statement about how this impacted his identity as a Japanese individual. You can see that Olympia's throw has been replaced here by a Japanese embroidery. And you can also see that here Morimura plays both parts, the Black Maid as well as Olympia. He plays with race and layering of race, and at the same time with ideas of beauty in a classical sense, and with the notion of attraction in itself. What is beautiful? Look at the blonde wig that it's placed on his head, just kind of haphazardly to suggest this idea of construction, and the lack of effort of concealing his body. He basically stages himself like Olympia, but without appropriating any other sexual attribute that we associate with femininity, in order to blur the boundaries between the feminine and the masculine and give life to a different kind of beauty, a different kind of appreciation of what might be beautiful and what might be not. And more recently as well, he did another take on the same subject. This is probably his most famous work, anyway, the take on Manet's Olympia. This is called A Modern Olympia, that he remade in 2018, so very recently. And again, you might want to consider um, as food for thought. On that note, I hope we have explored enough conceptions of beauty in art. There is so much more, but I really cared for you to get a picture of what beauty does in art, what roles it can play. And I just wanted to wrap up to make sure it's clear that much of modern and contemporary art, following the examples of Manet and Duchamp, and some could claim also Picasso, Anna Hock. There are many artists who, during the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, tried to reimagine art. You can think of Egon Schiele, trying to reimagine art outside of beauty, just because beauty had been done so much. And the fear, the danger that beauty might be an easy way in, that we might just ask of our viewers to find pleasure in art, when perhaps art can do a lot more. You also have to remember that at the beginning of the last century, when Duchamp launched the ready-made and when other artists rejected beauty in a more defined way, artists were seriously concerned that painting was going to be absorbed by the entertainment media of the time that were capturing a lot of attention. So film and photography were falling into a category that painting wanted to resist. The idea of film as entertainment, photography as entertainment or curiosity, painting moving away from beauty represents this kind of statement of separation, the desire to stay conceptually grounded and to remain at a level of engagement that surpasses at least photography and film at the time. So there are many considerations to draw, but all of these considerations reverberate into the history of today's modern and contemporary art. The aesthetic that you might choose in your work, or the aesthetic that you might see when you visit a museum, deals with beauty in ways that take all of this into account. The easy way in, the distraction. On that note, see you in the next lecture.